The morning I handed over my resignation letter was supposed to be the worst day of that year. I had planned for it, rehearsed it, told myself I was ready. I was not ready. But that morning, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the building I had spent 4 years turning into something real, I thought the hard part was almost over. I thought the leaving was the ending. I had no idea my father-in-law was already on the phone with a real estate attorney. Let me back up, because none of what happened makes sense without the version of my life that existed before it started falling apart in a way I couldn't see yet. My name is Ivy. I was 29 years old. I had a small business I had built from nothing, a house I had bought with my own savings and a modest inheritance from my grandfather, and a husband named Owen who, in the early years, had made me feel like I was the most capable person he had ever met. I had, in other words, the kind of life that looks from the outside like everything is fine. The problem with everything looking fine from the outside is that it gives you no early warning system for what is building on the inside. Owen's father, Franklin, was 67 years old, a retired civil engineer from Dayton, Ohio, the kind of man who wore khaki pants on weekends and had opinions about load-bearing walls. He was not loud. He did not raise his voice. He called me sweetheart in a tone that managed to contain within it a complete summary of his feelings about my presence in his son's life. He had silver hair. He kept short and precise, and he shook hands with everyone, and he smelled like cedar and something industrial, like a garage. He called our house Owen's Place every single time for 3 years without a single exception. I corrected him twice. After that I stopped because some arguments cost more than they return. Owen was an only child. His mother had passed away when he was 16, and I think that loss had done something to the two of them that neither of them could name or would have admitted to if asked. Franklin had raised Owen alone through high school and college, and the bond between them had the particular quality of something that had been forged under pressure and never fully released. Owen was capable and generous in most areas of his life. But where his father was concerned, he had a blind spot the size of a billboard. The first time I noticed the questions, really noticed them rather than brushing them off, was about a year and a half into the marriage. We had gone to Franklin's for the 4th of July. He had grilled hamburgers and set off small fireworks in the backyard, and the evening had been pleasant enough until it wasn't. We were sitting on the patio when Franklin set down his beer and said, very casually, "The way you say something you have been thinking about since March, Ivy, is the business in your name only, or is Owen listed anywhere?" I looked at Owen. Owen was watching the neighbor's dog. "Just mine," I said. It was a straightforward answer. The business was an event planning company I had started at 25 with $3,000 and a website I built myself. Owen had never worked in it, had never invested in it, had no legal connection to it. I answered because it was factually uncomplicated and because I had not yet learned to treat factually uncomplicated questions with suspicion. Franklin nodded slowly. "Smart," he said, "to keep things clean. And the house? That's both names?" "Both names," I said, "to keep things clean." "And the house, that's both names?" "Both names," I said. He picked up his beer. Of course. Just good to know these things, keep everything organized." Owen reached over and refilled my lemonade without looking at me. I watched Franklin watch the sky, and I told myself I was reading into things. That is the first lie you tell yourself. There are many more after it. The questions continued over the following months, spaced out, deniable individually. Franklin asked about the mortgage terms, framed as interest in our financial well-being. He asked about what would happen to the business if I ever wanted to step back, framed as long-term planning. He asked Owen, within my hearing, whether we had updated our wills since the wedding. He said it while I was in the kitchen getting coffee, speaking just loud enough for me to hear without addressing me directly. That particular move, I would come to understand, was intentional. I started sleeping badly, not dramatically. I just stopped sleeping all the way through the night, started waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning, with a quiet, unnamed weight on my chest that I could not explain in the daylight and so didn't try. There were other things. Franklin began stopping by the house more frequently. He always had a reason. a tool Owen had borrowed. Leftovers from Sunday dinner. A newspaper article he had clipped and thought Owen would find interesting. He moved through the rooms on these visits with an ease that made the back of my neck tighten. Once, I came home early from a client meeting to find Franklin's truck in the driveway and Franklin in the backyard walking the perimeter of the property line with a measuring tape. Owen was at work. Franklin had a key. He smiled when he saw me come around the side of the house. "Just checking on that fence section," he said. "The one Owen mentioned might need replacing." I looked at the fence. It was a perfectly functional fence. I looked at Franklin. He folded the measuring tape and slid it into his pocket and said, "You want me to take a look at the gutters while I'm here?" That evening, I told Owen that his father had been in the backyard with the measuring tape. Owen said his dad was handy. He was probably just being helpful. I said he didn't mention any fence issues to me. Owen said he had mentioned it to his dad a few weeks back. He probably forgot to loop me in. I said he had a key to our house and he was measuring the property line without telling either of us he was coming over. Owen said, "Dad doesn't need an invitation, he's family." That sentence, "He doesn't need an invitation, he's family." I would think about it for a long time afterward. It is a sentence that sounds like warmth and functions like permission. The year that cracked everything open started in February with a promotion. My business had grown steadily enough that I had begun taking on corporate clients. And in February, a regional hotel chain contracted me to manage their event calendar for 12 months. It was the kind of contract that changes the shape of a small business. Real money, a real timeline, real proof that what I had built was worth building. I came home and told Owen over dinner. He was genuinely happy for me. That part was real. He squeezed my hand across the table and said he was proud of me, and I believed him because that part was true. When we told Franklin the following weekend, he tilted his head and said, "Big commitment, a whole year. You sure you have the bandwidth with everything you two are juggling at home?" He smiled. "Just asking. I know how much you got going on." I counted to 3 silently and asked if he wanted more potato salad. In April, I hired a part-time assistant. In May, I signed a second corporate client. In June, Owen started coming home late. It wasn't dramatic. It never announced itself. He had explanations, always plausible, always just slightly too smooth. A project running long. Traffic. A happy hour with coworkers he hadn't mentioned until he walked in at 8. I told myself I was stressed from the new contracts. I told myself I was projecting. I had gotten so good at telling myself things that weren't true that I had essentially automated the process. The first real signal came in July. I was picking up Owen's dry cleaning, something I'd offered to do because I was passing the cleaner on my way back from a client walkthrough, and the woman behind the counter handed me the clothes and then said, "Oh, and your husband was in last week with a blazer. He already paid." Just so you know. Owen hadn't mentioned the blazer. Not strange on its own. But the dry cleaner was 3 blocks from my office, which was on the opposite side of the city from where Owen worked. I drove home without turning on the radio. I thought about the dry cleaner and the blazer and the opposite side of the city. I thought about the late evenings and the cash withdrawals I had noticed on the joint account statement, amounts small enough to be deniable, a pattern large enough to be deliberate once you knew to look for it. I did not confront Owen that night. I had learned from years of watching Franklin operate that confrontation without preparation is just giving the other person time to arrange their story. So I waited. I paid attention. I started keeping notes on my phone, dates and details, and things that seemed small until they were sitting next to each other. The second signal came 3 weeks later, and it came from a place I would never have expected. I was looking for the extra set of house keys, the ones we kept in the drawer of the entryway table for guests. The keys weren't in the drawer. What was in the drawer, underneath a stack of takeout menus, was a business card. A real estate attorney named Warren Colby, and on the back of the card, in Franklin's handwriting, a date from 2 months earlier, a dollar amount, and the address of our house. I stood in the entryway for a long moment. I turned the card over twice. Then I took a photo of it and put it back exactly where I found it. That night I called my cousin Faye. Faye was the most straightforward person I knew, a paralegal who had spent 8 years watching people make the same preventable mistakes in family court. I told her what I had found. I told her about the measuring tape and the questions and the late nights and the cash. She let me finish without interrupting, and when I was done, she said, "Ivy, you need a family law attorney tomorrow." Not next week, tomorrow. The attorney's name was Cora Hendricks. She had an office downtown with good light and no family photos on the desk, which I found reassuring in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I spread everything out for her. The business card, the photos of the joint account statements, the notes on my phone, the timeline of Franklin's visits and questions. She listened without reacting. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "What you're describing is a coordinated information-gathering campaign about your assets," she said. "The attorney on that card is a real estate specialist. Someone retained him to evaluate options related to your property. Given that your husband's name is on the house and his father appears to be directing the inquiry, the concern is that your husband is being positioned to act on the property without your knowledge or consent." I asked what acting on the property could mean. A quitclaim deed, if he can get you to sign one. A forced sale if the marriage dissolves and he argues for equity. Or, depending on what that attorney advised, something more aggressive. She looked at the business card photo on my phone. "Do you have separate accounts?" I had opened a personal savings account 2 years earlier, a habit from before the marriage that I had kept up quietly. I told her about it. She said good. She said to move nothing dramatic, but to document every joint account balance that week with screenshots and to send her copies. She also gave me the name of a forensic accountant. His name was Barry Sims. He worked out of an office near the courthouse, and he had the specific, calm manner of someone who has seen financial manipulation so many times that it has become almost taxonomically interesting to him. I brought him 14 months of joint account statements, the mortgage documents, the business incorporation papers, and the household expense records I kept in a spreadsheet out of habit from my early business days. He went through everything slowly. He asked me questions in a quiet, methodical way. He asked about the cash withdrawals. He asked about a series of small transfers to an external account I hadn't recognized. He asked whether Owen managed any household bills independently, whether he had access to any accounts I might not have full visibility into. Barry called me 6 days later and asked me to come in. The joint savings account, the one we had been building together for 4 years, the one I had thought of as our house fund, our future contingency, had been reduced by just over $11,000 over the preceding 16 months. Not in dramatic chunks, in transfers of $200, $300, $450, always below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic alert. The receiving account was a personal savings account at a credit union in Dayton, Ohio. It was in Franklin's name. I sat across from Barry, and I looked at the account number on the screen, and I thought about the business card in the drawer and the measuring tape in the backyard. And every Sunday afternoon I had spent at Franklin's kitchen table being called sweetheart in that particular tone. I thought about Owen saying he doesn't need an invitation, he's family. I thought about all the ways I had dismissed my own perception because the person I trusted most had told me I was reading into things. $11,000, 16 months, a receiving account in Dayton. "Is this enough?" I asked Cora when I called her from the parking lot outside Barry's building. "It's a strong foundation," she said. "I want to know if any deeds have been filed or modified. I'm going to run a check with the county recorder this week. In the meantime," she paused. "Have you decided what you want to do?" I looked at the steering wheel. I thought about the hotel contract and the second client and the part-time assistant and the business I had built from $3,000. I thought about the house with the blue-gray siding that I had repainted myself the first summer. The garden in the back where I grew tomatoes every year regardless of whether they came in well. "I want the house," I said. "I want the money back, and I want them to know exactly what I know before any of it is over." Cora said she could work with that. I lived with what I knew for the next 4 weeks. I did not change my behavior. I showed up to Sunday dinners at Franklin's. I sat across from him and passed the bread basket and talked about the weather and the business and whatever else he offered, and I watched him look at me with that patient, proprietorial certainty, and I smiled and I counted and I said nothing. I had learned from watching Franklin for 3 years that the most effective thing you can do when someone underestimates you is to let them keep underestimating you until the moment it costs them something. During those 4 weeks, I did 2 things outside of the legal work Cora was managing. The first was to document every unusual interaction in a note on my phone. Dates, exact words, context. The note became longer than I wanted it to be. The second was to handle a small piece of financial housekeeping that Cora had suggested and that I had decided to do slightly ahead of the timeline she recommended because I had a feeling about timing, and my feelings about timing had recently been proven correct. Owen and I had a joint credit card. The primary cardholder was me. Owen was an authorized user. There was also a supplemental card on the account, one I had added for Franklin 2 years earlier when Owen's car had broken down and Franklin had driven 4 hours to help, and I had wanted to cover his gas and meals on the way back. A gesture of goodwill. The card was still active. I had forgotten about it. I suspected Franklin had not. I called the card company on a Tuesday afternoon. I requested a full statement of recent charges on the supplemental card, a new primary contact number for the account, and a freeze on the supplemental card pending review. The representative was efficient. It took 9 minutes. I noted the time. Then I waited. The confrontation I had planned with Cora, precise and timed and attorney-approved, was not the confrontation I ended up having. Real situations have a way of accelerating past your careful timeline when the other party decides to move. Franklin moved on a Sunday afternoon in October. We were at his house for dinner. He had made pot roast, which he always made in October as if the arrival of fall required a specific beef response. The house smelled of onions and the industrial cleaning product he used on everything. Owen was in the living room watching football. I was in the kitchen doorway when Franklin set down a dish towel and said, without turning around, "Ivy, I've been meaning to talk to you about something practical." I said, "Sure." He turned and looked at me with an expression I had seen him use when he was being reasonable at someone. "Owen and I have had some conversations this fall," he said, "about the future, about what makes sense for the family going forward." He paused. "The house situation, having things titled the way they are, it's not really set up to protect Owen the way it should be. We think it would be smart to simplify things." I kept my face neutral. "What kind of simplifying?" He moved to the counter and opened a folder that was sitting there, already open, already waiting. Inside were several documents: a property transfer form, a quit-claim deed with my name in the grantor line and a blank where my signature belonged. "It's not dramatic," he said. "Just a clarification of the ownership arrangement. Owen's already looked it over." He held the folder out to me. I did not take it. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Franklin, I need to ask you something first." He waited, folder still extended. "How much of the joint savings have you transferred to your account at the Dayton Credit Union in the last 16 months? The folder stayed in the air between us for 2 full seconds. I counted them. Then something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not in a way anyone watching casually would have caught. But I was not watching casually. I had been watching Franklin Mercer for 3 years, and I knew his face the way you know the face of someone who has been deciding things about your life without telling you. He lowered the folder. He set it on the counter. "I don't know what you think you found," he said. $11,240, I said. "Account ending in 3819. Transfers between March of last year and this July. Would you like the specific dates, or do you already have those?" The kitchen was very quiet. Franklin's expression had gone somewhere I hadn't seen it go before. The careful social architecture was down. Underneath it, he looked exactly like what he was, a man whose plan had run into something he hadn't accounted for. "Owen," I said without raising my voice. A pause, then footsteps. Owen appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of someone who has been bracing for a sound they've been hearing approach for a long time. He looked at his father. He looked at the folder on the counter. He looked at me. The next 40 minutes were not the conversation any of us had prepared for. Franklin tried to reframe first. He was skilled at reframing. The transfers were loans, informal ones, intended to help cover some unexpected expenses, and he had every intention of returning the money. He had simply been waiting for the right time. The property documents were not coercive. They were practical, sensible, drawn up to protect his son, which was a father's right and responsibility. I was misunderstanding the situation. I was, he said, always a little quick to misunderstand things. Owen said Dad twice and was talked over both times. I am not misunderstanding $11,000, I said. I said it evenly. I said it the way Cora had coached me to say things, without heat, without the kind of emotion that gets reframed as hysteria. I have a forensic accountant's report, a bank statement trail, and a real estate attorney's business card with your handwriting on the back. Those things don't misunderstand. Franklin looked at Owen. Owen was looking at the floor. Then Franklin said the thing he had clearly decided was his closing argument. Owen is my son. This is his family. I have spent 50 years building things for this family, and what I do to protect my son is not something that needs your approval. The kitchen was completely still. I looked at Owen. I said, I need you to look at me. He looked up. I want you to understand something, I said. I am not asking you to choose between me and your father. That is his framing, and it is not the real question. The real question is whether you knew about the transfers. A pause. The real question is whether you handed your father access to a credit card that wasn't his. Another pause. The real question is whether you knew what was in that folder before tonight. Owen said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, he's my dad. I thought he was just planning ahead. That was the most honest thing he said to me that day, and it was the confirmation of everything. I left Franklin's house at 7:15. I drove home without music. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment and looked at the house with the blue-gray siding and the garden in the back, and the porch I had repainted the summer we moved in. Then I went inside and called Cora and said, we're moving forward, all of it. She filed the forensic complaint naming Franklin with the state's Financial Crimes Unit on Monday morning. The property protection order went in the same day. A letter to Owen's attorney by end of business. Owen retained an attorney by noon, which told me the Sunday dinner had been less spontaneous than it appeared. I moved into Faye's apartment, not because I couldn't stay in the house legally. Cora had confirmed it was protected, but because I needed to not sleep in rooms that held 7 years of accumulated silence. Faye made terrible coffee and asked only questions that were worth asking. Every evening I sat at her kitchen table and worked through documents and felt, steadily and without drama, like myself again. Franklin's response moved through the family the way his responses always moved, through phone calls and framing. Owen's aunt texted me about keeping things private. A cousin I had met twice sent a message about how divorce brings out the worst in people. Each one carried Franklin's fingerprints, the same language, the same careful positioning of me as the problem. I let every message go unanswered. Owen called from a number I didn't recognize because he knew I wouldn't pick up his own. I answered anyway. The money was supposed to come back, he said. Dad was covering some things and I thought it would be short term. I let that sit for a moment. You thought your father could take $11,000 from our joint account and return it before I noticed, I said. A long pause. Say it out loud, I said. It sounds like I let you down, he said. I was not angry. I was something quieter than angry, something that had been settling into place for months. I'm not interested in the version of us that required me to not notice things, I said. I see clearly what we are. That's all. He said Dad the way he always said it when he ran out of other words. A reflex, not an argument. I know, I said. That's exactly why we're here. The divorce took 8 weeks. Owen did not contest it. Barry's documentation was specific enough that a contested filing would have been inadvisable for everyone. Franklin's attorney negotiated a settlement of the financial complaint without his client admitting wrongdoing, which was the minimum necessary to keep the matter in civil court rather than criminal. He returned every dollar with 6% interest. Cora had asked for interest. Barry's records were precise enough that the figure was not negotiable. I sat in Cora's office the afternoon the last papers were signed and felt something release in my chest that I had been holding for longer than I knew. "It's done," I said. "She said you came prepared. That made all the difference." Faye called me 2 evenings later while I was back at the house, sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the October light move through the garden. The tomato plants were finished for the year. The canes needed cutting back. I had a list. "Ivy?" Faye said, her voice low the way it gets when she's reporting something. "Are you somewhere you can talk?" She told me that Franklin had thrown a dinner party. The previous Saturday, 2 days after the settlement was finalized, as if the timing had been deliberate, he had reserved the private room at a steakhouse in Dayton, invited the extended family, Owen's college friends, the neighbors Franklin had never introduced me to in 3 years of Sunday dinners. Owen had been there with a woman named Charlotte, quiet and pretty and already wearing a ring on a hand Franklin had apparently introduced to the table with a toast about new chapters and answered prayers. And he had tried to put the dinner on the supplemental card, the card I had frozen in October. My phone rang while Faye was still talking. Franklin's number. I let it ring twice. I set down my wine glass. I answered. "There's something wrong with the card," he said. His voice had none of its usual careful architecture. He sounded exactly like a man standing in a restaurant with a declined card and 40 people watching. "It's not processing. There must be an error on your end. I need you to." "There's no error," I said. "I froze the supplemental card 3 months ago. My attorney has documentation of every charge made on it going back 2 years, and a $2,000 charge at a Dayton steakhouse is going to make for interesting reading." A silence. "I hope the dinner was nice," I said. "You have $11,000 back in your account with interest. I'm sure you can cover it." I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment in the particular quiet of a house that belongs entirely to you. Then I turned off the light above the sink and went back out to the porch and picked up my wine and sat down in the cool October air and looked at the garden and the light. 6 months after that, I was sitting on the same porch on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee, the good kind, the strength I liked. Watching the light come across the beds, I had already started prepping for spring. The business had its best quarter on record. I had hired a second part-time employee in January and was interviewing for a third. The house felt like the house again, not a contested thing, not a negotiation, just the place where I lived and which was mine. The DA's office had declined to pursue criminal charges against Franklin. Cora had told me that outcome was possible, that civil resolution was sometimes where these things landed, and that a permanent paper trail was its own form of consequence. The money was back, the property was protected. The record existed in a county courthouse in a file that would follow Franklin Mercer for the rest of his professional life. Owen sent an email 6 weeks after everything was finalized. 2 careful paragraphs, reviewed by his attorney, expressing something that approximated regret. He said he had been caught in the middle. He said he hoped I could eventually understand. I read it once. I did not respond. An explanation is not the same as an accountability. I had spent 3 years learning to tell the difference, and I was not going to unlearn it now. I heard Drew Faye in the way you hear things through family, whether you want to or not, that Franklin had introduced Charlotte at every possible occasion since the dinner, that Owen seemed happy or was performing happiness in a way that would probably become the same thing over time, that the extended family had reorganized itself around the new configuration with the efficiency that families display when a disruption has been processed and filed away. I felt nothing particular about any of this. I had not married Franklin Mercer's family because I wanted to belong to it. I had built a life. The life was here. I was in it. The hotel contract renewed in February with a 10% increase. My assistant sent me a card with a small succulent plant and a note that said, "Well deserved." I kept the plant on the windowsill in my office above the kitchen. It was still alive in March. I considered that a good sign. Faye came for dinner on a Friday in April. We sat on the porch after eating, the way we always did now, with wine and no required performance. At some point she said, Do you miss any of it? I thought about it honestly. I thought about the pot roast Sundays and Owen's hand squeezing mine across the dinner table in the early years, and the version of my life I had believed I was building before I understood what was being built around me without my knowledge. I miss who I thought we were, I said. I don't miss finding out we weren't. Faye nodded and didn't say anything else, and we sat in the easy silence of people who understand each other, and the April air was cool and smelled of the garden starting up again, and the house behind us was lit and warm and entirely, fully, legally mine. That was enough. It turned out to be more than enough. I used to think that the worst thing a person could do to you was lie to your face. I know better now. The worst thing is when they tell you the truth in small enough pieces that you spend years convincing yourself you're imagining it. Franklin never lied to me outright. He asked questions. He measured things. He moved through my life with a patience that, for a long time, I mistook for indifference. It wasn't indifference. It was calculation. And the difference between those two things is something I had to lose $11,000 and 3 years of sleep to fully understand. What I keep coming back to is this. I did not win because I got angry. I did not win because I made noise or issued ultimatums or gave speeches. I won because I got quiet and I got organized. There is a version of this story where I confront Owen the night I saw the dry cleaner receipt, where I demand answers and cry and make him feel the weight of what he allowed. That version ends differently. It ends with me holding less paperwork and more grief and a settlement that benefits people who are counting on me to react emotionally rather than strategically. I am grateful now that I was tired enough by that point to be calm. I think about the women I know who have been in versions of this situation, not always money, not always property, but the same basic structure. Someone underestimating them so completely that the underestimation itself becomes a vulnerability for that person. Franklin assumed I would not check the account statements carefully enough. He assumed I would not notice the transfers, and if I noticed, I would not understand them, and if I understood them, I would not know what to do. He had watched me navigate 3 years of Sunday dinners without making a scene. He took that as evidence that I couldn't. It was actually evidence that I was choosing not to. There is an enormous difference between those two things, and the people who mistake your restraint for weakness tend to find out the hard way. Owen is a more complicated part of this to sit with. I do not think he is a bad person. I think he's a person who prioritized peace over honesty for so long that he lost the ability to tell the difference between them. He wanted to keep his father happy and keep his marriage intact, and he chose, over and over, the path that required the least from him in the moment and the most from me in the long run. That is a failure of character, not of intelligence or love, and I have had to make my peace with the fact that those two things are not the same. You can love someone and still fail them in ways that are not recoverable. What I know now that I did not know at 26 is that protecting yourself is not the opposite of loving someone. It is what you do when you have learned through hard evidence that love without documentation is just trust without a safety net. I do not mean that cynically. I mean that practically. I kept records because I am organized. It turns out that being organized is a form of integrity. It turns out that knowing your own account numbers and reading your own statements and hiring your own attorney is not paranoia. It is just being a person who takes her own life seriously. The climbing rose along the back fence is fuller this year than it was last year. The tomatoes came in better than I expected. My business had its best quarter in 4 years. None of that happened because someone gave it to me. It happened because I built it and then I protected it, and then I got up the next morning and kept going. That is the only philosophy I have. Keep going. Keep records. Know what you're worth. And when someone declines your credit card at their victory dinner, let them figure out how to pay the bill.